Climate change is a fact. We know its causes and effects. In the words of Alok Sharma, president of COP26,
our global political economy, built on fossil fuels for the last century, is in a state of flux. Concurrently, leaders and their citizens around the world are dealing with spiraling climate impacts. Climate catastrophes are becoming more frequent, and sadly they're becoming more ferocious.
heat waves, storms, rising oceans, wildfires. Recently, 1/3 of Pakistan was submerged by historic flooding, affecting 33 million people. More than 1,000 people died. It is estimated that by 2050, 1.2 billion people will be climate refugees. We know what we need to do, but are we doing enough? To discuss about climate change and the respective policies, we have with us Rachel Kyte, who is the Dean of the Fletcher School at the Tufts University, and according to Time magazine, one of the 15 women who lead climate change. Hello, thank you for being here with us today.
Well, it's lovely to be here.
I would like to ask you to start with a very basic question. We keep on talking about the climate crisis and the problems there. What is it really about? Can we?
Yeah, let's strip it all the way back to its basics. It is that the carbon pollution that we've been pumping into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but then in earnest for the last 50 years, is warming the planet. It's preventing the planet from cooling itself and interrupting its natural cycles, the result of which is that we are beginning to push natural ecosystems to their tipping point. We are cutting down forests, which is exacerbating the cycle, because forests are, of course, a natural sink. The acid from that pollution is changing the chemistry of the oceans, which means that the oceans cannot play the role that they play. And so cumulatively, we are now expecting to have warming of perhaps 2-3 degrees. This is going to be devastating because it's going to see large amounts of sea level rise. It's going to mean that the poles, the Arctic and the Antarctic, which are the thermostats for the planet, will start to lose their capacity to play that role as ice begins to melt and disappear. We're going to see extreme weather events, changing weather patterns, extreme heat, extreme rainfall events, which is going to devastate our crop production. And so we are making the planet inhabitable by humans. The planet will survive. I think people mistake it. They think that somehow we're destroying the planet. We're not destroying the planet. We're changing the planet, but we're making it very difficult for people to live peaceably on it.
How much time do we have to do something to reverse that? You were talking about the heating goes up to 2-3 Celsius degrees. There was a target of 1.5 in the last summit for the climate. Where are we today when it comes to that? What can we do?
Well, at the last summit in Paris, so the Paris Agreement, to which every country agreed, stipulated that we should limit warming to way below 2 degrees. That was the official negotiated text. Developing countries, especially those that were the most vulnerable, said, we think that we need to understand whether 2 is still too much. And so a scientific study took place, and it came back and it looked at the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2. And really 1.5 becomes the target, because at 2 we start to lose all kinds of ecosystems, and we lose a number of islands around the world, and coastal areas become inundated. It's still possible to get to 1.5. But this means that we have to peak emissions, so actually start lowering emissions globally by about 2025, which means that we have to have a very steep shift in our energy systems, in our transport systems, in heavy industry, and we have to stop deforesting, especially around the tropical forests of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. If we do all of that, the science shows that we can peak emissions about 2025, and then we can rapidly decrease them. And we arrive at 1.5 degrees or net zero emissions by about 2050. And you see companies around the world and countries around the world committing to being net zero by the middle of the century. Now, every week, every month that we don't take these sort of drastic actions in some respect, it makes it more difficult to hit that target. And now there's a sort of open conversation about should we still talk about 1.5 degrees because we're making it so hard for ourselves because we're running out of time.
And now with the crisis in the invasion of Ukraine and the crisis in the energy market, priorities have shifted a lot from the government to keeping the energy prices low. How does this affect the climate change? Because in the beginning, some people said, oh, maybe it's an opportunity to move towards renewables and so on and so forth. But now it seems that that's not the discussion at all. How this has affected the discussion, and not only the discussion, the actual policies on climate change?
So the policies haven't changed, which is interesting, but what countries are doing to manage the energy supply crisis has. So we're going to have a situation where more coal will be burned this year and next year in a short-term response to Europe moving away from Russian hydrocarbons. Obviously, Europe has gone all around the world to buy up gas, and Europe now has the biggest gas reserves it's ever had. That's forced prices up for the rest of the world. But there's been an economic downturn, and so emissions have only increased globally by 1% this year, which is much slower than we expected. But the medium term, Europe is committed to energy efficiency, and renewable energy is doubling down. So you're going to have gas in the mix. Obviously, that's important for Greece. But the proportion of gas has to drastically reduce. And in fact, Europe could still meet its 55% reduction targets easily. Now, in the other parts of the world, there's a response not so much to Europe's pivot away from Russian hydrocarbons, but there's a response to the hypocrisy that people see in Europe's position, which is Europe's happy to burn gas itself, happy to burn coal itself in an emergency, but unhappy to invest in other countries' ability to burn coal and gas. But of course, we've only got one planet, so two wrongs don't make a right. Everybody has to move forward with cleaner energy. But there's a real investment desert. It's very hard to find the investment to flow into renewable energy quickly enough, and that's what we have to solve. And that's what we'll be talking about in the talks in Egypt.
So now you have, yes, the CO27, the COP27 in Egypt. What are the main challenges that?
Well, so we've got this very difficult, dislocated year, and a number of countries are going to come and they're going to say, well, we're making progress, but we're not making enough progress. And so we have to deal with that dynamic. There's going to be some, I think, announcements that people are becoming very serious about removing methane from the atmosphere. Methane is a pollutant. It's also an accelerant of climate impacts, and so that's important. But the main focus, I think, is going to be on adaptation and loss and damage. Adaptation is the ability to adapt to the impacts of climate change we're experiencing, and loss and damage is the concept that the problem was caused by the industrialized world. It's being experienced, and the impacts are in the developing world, and there should be a transfer of technology and resources and help, reparations or compensation, if you want to use those words, to the developing world. And up till now, Europe, but in particular the United States, have been implacably opposed to financing loss and damage. But we're now at the point where I think that opposition will have to be overcome.
Who is hit most from the climate change that we have in the planet?
Well, it's interesting because we're now in an era where everybody's being affected, right? I mean, I live in a nice suburb of Boston, and we had an incredible drought this summer, and we have heat waves, etc. But because I'm, comfortably middle income, I can find a way to survive. But if you're living on low income in a concrete jungle in the middle of a city in the United States or anywhere else in the world, you might not be able to find somewhere to get cool. You've got to go on public transport, which is not cooled. You're at risk, right, from extreme heat. But in the developing world, again, it is people who are on lower income and people who are most vulnerable, those who are living on the sea's edge, those who are living in areas where extreme heat is unavoidable. So it is the poorest are the most vulnerable, the elderly, the children, and of course often women, because they may be in the villages and the men have gone to cities to work. They may not have the access to energy or water resources or to improved seeds so that they can grow crops that withstand the heat and the drought. So as with most things, if you are low income and vulnerable, even if you're in a rich country, climate change is dangerous for you now.
We had Lula was elected in Brazil. It's important because of the forest in Brazil. He's committed into changing and improving what the damage Bolsonaro has done with the forest. How serious is he? How important is his election when it comes to the environment?
It's very, very important. Brazil has an important role to play for its own sake, and then a critically important role to play for the global environment. Mm-hmm. Under the last Lula government, and then under President Dilma, the follow-on from the Lula government, the rate of deforestation in the Amazon dropped drastically. His then Environment Minister, Isabella Teixeira, was fundamental in the negotiating of the Paris Agreement. So now he comes back and he will put Marina Silva in as his Environment Minister, of course, who has a 20, 30-year track record of really pushing through issues of Amazonian protection. And so he's very serious.
Our governments in general, and that's my last question, around the world, we see some weird things going around, like Britain going through many elections, the US with what happened in the Capitol Hill, we saw the Chinese Communist Party recent Congress. We see some policies that seem a bit off when it comes to the liberal world. What are the main challenges for the world, and what are the main challenges when it related to climate, sustainable policy, energy policies, and so on and so forth?
So since 2006, economists around the world have basically agreed violently, just like scientists around the world have agreed violently, on the impacts of climate change. And the economists since 2006, led by Lord Nicholas Stern from the UK, have said, look, the cost of inaction is way higher than the cost of action. So the economic sort of trajectory is as clear as the scientific trajectory. What happens is that when we have mainly right-wing populists, but it's also true for left-wing populists, they seem to bifurcate growth and the climate. So green growth is actually what we should be pursuing, offers best paid jobs, most jobs, local jobs, offers a chance to avoid the worst costs of climate change, etc. But when we get right-wing populists in power, or left-wing populists, so AMLO in Mexico, Trump, some of the policies that Liz Truss wanted to pursue, we have a situation where they sort of say, well, we're for growth, as if being green is going to eat away at growth, but actually green growth is the only path forward. So I think this is where populism and nationalism gets in the way. We also need as much cooperation as possible. So for leaders who are not multilateral, I think this poses a real problem for the system.
Thank you very much. We're looking forward to see what will happen in Egypt and what we'll see in the near future. And I hope to have the chance to talk to you again in the future. Thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you.